what is paleoclimate? This is a pretty basic word if you take a close look at it. Paleo meaning past and climate meaning climate. So it is basically the study of past climates. Scientists use clues or proxies, which are the fingerprints of past climate, to interpret paleoclimate and understand the Earth as a system. By studying the past Earth, we can predict how the future Earth would change. This is the idea behind the famous phrase in geology, the past is the key to the future. So we kind of get the idea of why people would study paleoclimate, but what is climate exactly? Climate is the weather pattern over an area for a long period of time. It is the average weather we can expect at a region. For example, I can say that the Maldives generally has a warm and humid climate, or like Norway has a cold climate. On the other hand, weather is the day-to-day condition, so it can be anything similar to the climate or something totally different. Like it was chilly and raining in the Maldives today. Now that we know the difference between climate and weather, let's talk about long-term climate. Long-term here means geological timescale. Remember how geologists often studied millions of years ago or thousands of years ago? Long-term climate here would be talking about that kind of scale. In a simple way, we can categorize the climate into two parts, the glacial period and interglacial period. Glacial period is the so-called ice age. This time would be cold and have relatively more glaciers. The last glacial period on Earth ended 15,000 years ago. Then we have the interglacial period. This would be warm and have relatively less or no glaciers. One interesting thing is that we are actually living in an interglacial period. Some might think that interglacial periods have to be a time where the whole world is like Sahara Desert or the Amazon forest, but that is actually not the case. Interglacial periods are periods that are relatively warmer in average temperature than the glacial periods. Then, how do we know that there were glacial interglacial changes? The concentration of greenhouse gas correlates to the glacial and interglacial temperature cycle. So if there is a way to study these concentrations, we can distinguish the glacial interglacial. Here is how the glacial interglacial temperature changed in the past. You can see that the difference between the average temperature for each glacial and interglacial period was actually smaller than 8 degrees Celsius. So it wasn't actually that much, but that temperature change, the 8 degrees Celsius, was enough to make a large difference in glacier amount. One thing to keep in mind when you are looking at paleoclimate graphs or any other graph is to check the x and y axis. The x shows the years before present, so the 0 would be today, and the left end 500,000 years ago is the older time. It is important to know the direction of time when you are looking at graphs for this class, and y-axis is the temperature. I've mentioned briefly that glacial interglacial cycles have a correlation with greenhouse gas. Some might know what this is, but some might have been questioning what greenhouse gas is. Greenhouse gas, also abbreviated as GHG, is any gas that has a property of absorbing infrared radiation, meaning heat energy, from the Earth's surface. This acts as a blanket on Earth, keeping the heat inside. So without greenhouse gas, the average temperature of Earth would be 0 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 18 degrees Celsius. The current average temperature of Earth is 15 degrees Celsius, so the effect of greenhouse gas warms the Earth by 33 degrees Celsius. Here are some important greenhouse gas. The water vapor is also an important greenhouse gas, but other than that, the three major GHGs are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. These usually increase and decrease synchronously. So if the warm interglacial period had a higher concentration of carbon dioxide, it will also have a high concentration of methane. So these are also called CO2, CH4, and N2O. These greenhouse gases play a major role in modern climate change due to the increase of industrial emission and farming. Now that we know what greenhouse gases are, let's see how they keep the Earth warm. Sun emits light in the form of shortwave by the bright white light that we see. When this light hits the surface of Earth, it is bounced back to the atmosphere in a longer form by losing some energy on the way. This longer wave is called long wave, also known as infrared or heat. Carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases trap the long wave and keep the heat within the Earth's atmosphere. So the more greenhouse gas we have, the more heat will be trapped inside Earth. Let's take a look at how extreme this can get. Our solar system actually has some good examples. So Venus, which has a thick blanket of gas, has an average temperature of 847 degrees Fahrenheit or 452 degrees in Celsius. On the other hand, Mars, that has an atmosphere thinner than Earth, has an average temperature of negative 81 Fahrenheit or negative 62 degrees in Celsius. And Mars actually has a very, very hot day and super chilly nights because it receives and emits heat rapidly due to the thin blanket it has. We have talked about long-term climate changes and greenhouse gas. Now let's see how the modern world has changed. This is a graph with methane gas concentration shown on the y-axis and years shown on the x-axis. Keep in mind that CO2 and methane gas fluctuate with high correlation. So higher methane would naturally mean higher CO2, which then equals to warmer temperature. So we can say that methane concentration has started skyrocketing near the 1800s or early 1900s. This period was when the Industrial Revolution took off and started burning more fossil fuels that released more CO2 and methane into the atmosphere. So, geologists say that the Industrial Revolution was the smoking gun of anthropogenic effect of increasing greenhouse gas on Earth. The annual and seasonal change of CO2 can be seen in the Keeling curve. This is a curve named after Dr. Keeling at Hawaii, who precisely measured the atmospheric CO2 change. The overall trend of increase in CO2 can be seen here. Another thing interesting to note is the small jigsaw pattern within the increasing trend. Scientists have concluded that this fall in the northern hemisphere summer is caused by more plants photosynthesizing and using up CO2. So, we have focused on atmosphere while talking about greenhouse gas. But did you know that the ocean is actually one of the largest CO2 reservoir and heat transporter? The Earth's ocean has two big circulations, one on the surface usually controlled by wind, and another deep, deep circulation that actually takes up most of the Earth. Think of the mantle of Earth. It's what actually drives the plate tectonics and is much greater in volume than the thin crust on top. The deep ocean circulation is called the thermohaline circulation, also known as the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt. It's called the thermohaline circulation because it is driven by temperature and salinity difference. This conveyor belt starts at the cold polar regions where water becomes to a near freezing point and sinks because of its high density. It then travels to the warmer tropical regions and soaks up the heat. This heat is slowly emitted as it moves to other colder regions north and south. And when it loses all its heat up and down in the polar regions, the whole circulation starts again. This circulation usually takes about 1500 years or so. While it transports heat to evenly distribute the warmth of sun to all across the world, it also carries nutrients. Now that we know how climate has changed, let's talk about how geologists actually study past climate. Geologists use different types of archives, depending on what time and what scale of change they want to look at. So for example, let's say I'm a geologist who wants to learn about the deep, deep time of Earth about 100 million years ago. Then you would have to study continental coastal sediments because that's the only time such climate could be recorded. On the other hand, I want to study annual changes. A high-resolution change of the near, let's say about 100 years. Then ice cores or tree rings would be an ideal archive. The archives are not going to tell us anything by just staring at them. You have to analyze the proxies, which are physical, chemical, and biological materials preserved within the archives. So these are like fingerprints of the past climate condition. Some things like volcanism can be seen in the ice core and marine sediment by the actual ash layer being deposited. Or we can look at the concentration of gas like CO2 or methane in ice cores to interpret the past climate. There are a lot of proxies in the world, and that is a whole other field of study itself. Here is an example of the ice core sample on the top. You can see the seasonal change occurring. The dark bands are the dust-abundant winter, and the lighter bands are summer, when there's a lot of snow to accumulate because of the higher humidity. These kind of annual layers get deposited to form a full glacier. So by counting the layers, you can get a very accurate age of the core. Now below is a different kind of core. It is the ocean sediment core. These are usually lower in time resolution because the sediment accumulation rate is much lower, but longer in time scale that it can reconstruct. Scientists drill these sediments from 3 to 4 kilometers below the sea using large research vessel drills. Now, side note, OSU has a great paleoclimate program with the renowned Bird, Polar, and Climate Research Center that focuses on ice cores and glaciers. All the round silver can things are the ice cores stored in the core repository at Bird Polar. The two people on the right is Dr. Lonnie Thompson and Ellen Thompson. They are both professors here at OSU and known for their contribution on paleoclimate. If you're curious, you can start by looking up his work with Al Gore on making the inconvenient truth. Below is another researcher at the center holding an actual ice core. So, now we know the past. We are now all kind of semi-professionals in paleoclimate. knowing that greenhouse gas contributes to climate change, how greenhouse gas traps heat, what archives and proxies can be used. Let's combine all that knowledge and try to think what will happen in the future. An international project called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or known as the IPCC, gathered since 1990 to generate reports on how climate will be changed by humans. This graph from the 2001 report shows that our temperature is just going to keep on increasing in the future, even if we take action. Note that the minimum increase is predicted to be nearly 2 degrees Celsius. Now, do you remember that I mentioned 8 degrees Celsius is the difference between our current world and ice age? That 8-degree change requires 1,000 years. But now we're seeing 1/4 of that in just a few decades. Such speed of increase has never been seen. This is why paleoclimate scientists keep on warning people that climate change is going to be sudden and possibly deadly. Some people, animals, or nations might not be ready for this drastic change. That brings us to the final part. What are the threats? There are actually a lot of things that can happen from climate change. People also used to use the term global warming, but that kind of started making everyone think that the whole world is uniformly becoming warm and led to some people yelling, the winter is actually colder. There is no global warming. But climate change or global warming does not mean that the whole world is evenly going to be toasted. It can actually bring out the extreme conditions of cold depending on the region. When scientists say global warming or climate change, we're implying that the average temperature is increasing. Anyways, going back, some of the hazards include extinction of species, ocean acidification that affects marine ecosystem, increase of deserts, and sea level rise. Sea level rise is one of the most direct hazards that humans will experience. This is because sea level increases by glaciers melting from the climate change, and it usually impacts coastal areas that are heavily populated. Human civilization tend to prosper around rivers or marine coasts. A lot of big cities like New York, San Francisco, LA, Miami, New Orleans are all near the ocean. The difference between interglacial and glacial sea level is about 120 meters, and the mean temperature change was about 8 degrees Celsius. That means that 2-degree change proposed by the IPCC could cause nearly 30 meters of sea level rise. Now, that is just by simply thinking. There are other complicated factors that go into fully model the sea level rise, so in real world it can be higher or lower than 30 meters. But the problem is just 1 meter of sea level rise would affect the red shaded areas you see here, and 6 meters will affect the yellow regions. And when I'm talking about affecting, it means that it is going to drown below the sea. So that is all for the lecture today, and I'll go over the practical lab instructions. If you have not read the reading material yet, go through the lab reading material on Carmen. Second, go to the discussion and follow instructions to discover the Huascaran Glacier that had an ice core drilled by the OSU Bird Polar Center using the fancy VR technology that they developed. Share with the class what you found interesting in this virtual reality. Last, complete the quiz to receive full credit for the class. Thank you.